Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to talk about the general care and maintenance of scuba regulators, including a few do's and don'ts, and then we'll take a look at what's involved when they're being serviced. So firstly, let's take a look at the general care and maintenance. When you purchase a new TV, a cooker, a washing machine, and also scuba regs, they all come with a user guide. Now we all know that many people just put them in a drawer and they never see the light of day. But scuba regulator guides are full of useful information, so please do read them. So there's your first do. Please read the user guide. If you don't have one, take a look at your regulator manufacturer's website and they should be available for you to download. Okay, so let's take a look at what you should do before you use your regs. Carefully check all the hoses and connections. You should look for cuts, splits or bulges on the hoses, and also check that any port plugs are not loose. This is your second do. So let's just have a quick look. Here's the regulator. This hose is a little bit loose. These ports are tight. We can check them with an Allen key. Make sure it fits. And then if necessary, we can tighten up our hoses. To tighten the hose, it just literally needs to be nipped up, so you can undo it and it's just a gentle bit of pressure to lock it tight. That is sufficient. Your next do is to inspect the stages for any signs of external damage. So check your second stage, see if there's any cracks, anything loose, etc. Check your first stage for dents or anything that looks out of place. Particularly with environmental stages, also check the diaphragm seal at the very top to make sure there's no splits in it, because that will make water get into the system if it does. Your next do is for your pre-dive, so before you actually get in the water, use your buddy check to make sure that the regulators are breathing correctly. You should know how to do this from your open water course, so it should be pretty straightforward, and you should know by checking the regulator in your mouth and checking your gauge, etc, etc. Okay, so you've completed your dive. We're now into the post-dive checks. Firstly, remove the regs from your cylinder as you've been taught on your open water course. This is another do. Thoroughly dry the dust cap and refit it. You have your screw-on dust cap for your DIN type regulators. Make sure it's thoroughly dry before you replace it on the DIN connection. And then you've got your A-clamp. Again, replace the dust cover, having made sure that this particular part is dry. Place it on and screw down the clamp. This is the most important don't. Don't allow water to get inside the first stage via the A-clamp or DIN fitting. This will necessitate a strip down and service of the regulator to prevent possible corrosion and irreparable damage. So on to our next step. The regs should then be rinsed thoroughly using clean water. After saltwater dives, it's also a good idea to soak the regs in a bath of warm, not hot, water for about an hour, preferably attached to a cylinder and pressurised as if you're actually diving with them. In all cases, either when rinsing or soaking, never press the purge buttons on the second stages, especially if the regs are unpressurised. This will allow water again to enter the hoses and possibly into the first stage. So again, this is your second big don't. Once you've cleaned them, rinse them off, have them soaking, etc. Dry them as much as you can, shake as much excess moisture off them and hang them up so any remaining water and moisture can drip off them. Doing this in a relatively warm area overnight should be long enough. Finally, once they're dry, store them away in your reg bag or a waterproof box, but avoid keeping them in areas of excessive heat or cold. If you come across any issues at all, either before, during or after your dive with your regulators, then this should be referred to a certified technician for investigation. So one of the common questions I'm often asked is, what tools do I actually need? Well, in truth, probably very few. A couple of spanners, some Allen keys, and maybe some O-rings. So if you need to tighten up the hose like we did earlier, then you'll need a 14mm. Some hoses will require a 15. These are quite often on the high pressure hose for your gauges. In old money or imperial, that would be a 9/16 or a 5/8. There are some on older type regs where you might require a slightly bigger spanner, maybe a 1/2 inch, but they're not very common these days. If you need to change the hose on one of your stages, quite often you will need a 17mm or an 11/16. Unfortunately, if you need to do this on a Scuba Pro regulator, you'll need to come to a technician because you'll require a special spanner to do it. It has lots of slots in it. It's not a proper spanner in the true sense of the word. As for Allen keys for your ports, I use a 3-way which has a 4, a 5 and a 6mm. This should fit all the standard port fittings on 99% of regs. You may also need a 7 or an 8 if you're using a cylinder with a DIN fitting and you need to put in an A-clamp adapter. So it's always useful to have one of those around. I would not advocate the use of adjustable wrenches in place of spanners, because all the metal parts on regulators are made of brass. Brass is a soft metal and you can easily damage it by not setting your wrench to the correct size and round the edges of a connection and not be able to get it undone without a use of a pair of pliers, which is just going to damage it even further. In terms of O-rings, you can buy little kits off eBay, etc., that will contain all the general sizes required. You've got an 010, an 011 and an 012 in here. This kit has got 012 and 011. 011 is for the low pressure hoses, so your inflator hoses, etc. The 012 is for the high pressure hoses, which you'll know is a slightly bigger fit. You'll also get some DIN and A-clamp O-rings in there, and this one's got some very tiny ones which are for the high pressure adapter when you connect the gauge, which you shouldn't need to be changing. You can also buy them in tubs, in bulk. Again, these are the ones I use when I'm replacing them on customers' regulators. Okay, so now we'll take a look at the servicing side of things. I've been a certified asset technician since 2016 and I can service most, if not all, makes of Scuba regulators and the associated equipment. I'm also a certified oxygen service technician, a cylinder technician and a gas blender. So, what happens to your equipment during a service? Regulator servicing is a very thorough process. When I receive a regulator, it is first visually inspected externally to check for any leaks, cracks and damage to hoses. Now you might think that cracks, you're never going to get a crack, but it does happen. I've recently had some regs in where this fitting on the DIN had a crack in it, so this whole piece has to be replaced completely. So it does and can occur. The regs are then put on the test rig and put under pressure of 200 bar. I then check the intermediate pressure, which is the pressure that the pressure from the cylinder is reduced from 232, etc., down to your breathable pressure, which is typically around about 9 to 10 bar. I then check the second stages to check the opening efforts, and these are checked on a magnehelic gauge. to make sure that all is correct. All these readings are documented so I know what we started with and can check them against what we're going to end with. The regs are then completely stripped down to the bare bones. Every single part that can be removed is removed. Every single O-ring that can be removed is also removed and put to one side. So all the hoses have O-rings on them. This is your LP hose on the second stage. There's an O-ring in there and there's also one on the other end. Those are both removed, and both ends of the hoses will also be cleaned at the same time. So once everything's been disassembled, everything goes into an ultrasonic bath. Okay, so we've removed all the O-rings from the low pressure. We also do the high pressure. So any gauges, items in the console are also removed and taken apart and also go into the cleaner. All parts are then cleaned in an ultrasonic bath. All the metal parts are cleaned using an enzyme-based agent, which does no harm to the metal. And all the plastic parts are cleaned with a citrus-based degreaser. All parts are then rinsed in hot, clean water and then dried using either compressed air or placed into a drying cabinet. They are then once again thoroughly inspected. This is to make sure you haven't missed anything, and if there was any corrosion or dirt in the way, it's now clean so you can actually see what's behind the dirt. Okay, so all parts are then rinsed in hot, clean water and then they're dried using either compressed air or a drying cabinet. They are then once again thoroughly inspected both externally and internally. This is especially important if there has been any water ingress, as we discussed previously. The regulator is then rebuilt using genuine manufacturer's service parts, and O-rings are lubricated as required using a silicone grease. These are an example of a couple of service kits. This one is for a second stage. This one is for a diaphragm first stage. If during inspection any parts are found to be defective that are not part of the service kit, then replacements would have to be ordered from the manufacturer and fitted as specified. The most common part to be replaced that may be out of spec would be an internal spring, because they can become slightly bent or they can become compressed from overuse. So we then reassemble all the parts, hopefully in the right order, and the stages are then once again placed upon the HP test rig. They are then tuned to the optimal performance settings as specified by the manufacturer. All service technicians will have copies of the manufacturer's service regulations and also their guides. This one's for an aqualung, and this talks you through all the steps of taking the regulator apart, putting it back together, and there's also a full diagram of where all the parts go. Finally, once the regulators have been reassembled and tuned, they are then tested once again, both out of and in water. This is to ensure there are no leaks and they come back to you ready for you to go off diving once again. All pressures, both before and after servicing, and all the parts that have been used are recorded and documented, so there is a trail for an audit if required. Also, just because your regs were serviced and you put them away in the cupboard and left them for a year or more, they will be fine to go back into the water. They may not. When regs are not used for extended periods, the O-rings can degrade and they can dry out. At the very least, they should be tested, but preferably serviced by a technician. Remember too, if equipment isn't maintained properly, then obviously problems can arise. Salt water can cause corrosion, build-up of sand and gravel or salt crystals can result in free-flowing regs or faulty dump valves. O-rings and other seals stretch or become brittle over time. Moving parts wear after repeated use. Batteries need replacing. Things just don't work quite reliably as they should. If in doubt, get it checked. Thank you.